Older viewers may remember, it is more than 10 years ago when I asked the then British Prime Minister, David Cameron, my goodness, how many we've had since then. I asked David Cameron in Parliament at Prime Minister's Question Time if he had read Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein, and if he had he read it to the end? Answer came there none, but all subsequent Prime Ministers and him have made it clear they either didn't read it or they didn't read it to the end. The end being the point at which, having carefully assembled a monster, Dr. Frankenstein discovered that it was no longer under his control, and that's why they call it a monster. I refer, obviously, to the horrific events that began the 3:15 a.m. New Year's morning in the United States of America, in the great city of New Orleans, of which I have fond memories. At 3:15 a.m., Shamsuddin, yes, that was his name. He is a former U.S. serviceman. Shamsuddin Jabbar, that was his name. Flying the black flags of ISIS, murdered 10 innocent revelers in New Orleans, celebrating New Year, and they didn't even get to see the sun rise on 2025. 10 dead, dozens wounded. And then Shamsuddin Jabbar got out of his pickup truck, armed to the teeth, and with an IED inside his vehicle alongside the black flag of ISIS. And he opened fire on law enforcement, which skillfully and bravely took him down. But there are more conspirators involved. It's believed 4 or 5 co-conspirators of ISIS are at large in the French Quarter of New Orleans, where other IEDs have been discovered. The monster is called a monster for a reason. And the reason I'm laboring this point is surely obvious, even to the thickest skulls in Western capitals. You cannot play with the terrorist monster. You cannot expect it to stay in the area of operations that you have licensed it to, armed it to, funded it to, proselytized for it to, propagandized for it to. For all of that is exactly what we have done. And we didn't just do it in Syria in the last few weeks, in the last few years. We did it in country after country after country. We did it against President Nasser in Egypt. We founded the so-called Muslim Brotherhood in the 1920s in Egypt with the purpose of undermining Arab unity, Arab national unity. And ultimately, we used that Muslim Brotherhood to try to subvert, undermine, and if possible, bring down the great Gamal Abdel Nasser, the greatest Arab leader of modern times. And we did it in Palestine, in Gaza, to undermine and weaken, and if possible, bring down my friend, the late President Arafat. And we did it in Afghanistan. This is something the Americans have now wiped from their collective memory. The reason there was a Taliban in the first place was that the recently departed and apparently saintly James L. Carter and Zbigniew Brzezinski, his Secretary of State, created what became the Taliban, the so-called Mujahideen. And we armed them, funded them, proselytized for them. Sandy Gall, every single night on News at 10, on ITN television in Britain, used to talk about these gallant, heroic, holy warriors, mujahideen. And how did that end? They succeeded, of course. They defeated the Soviet-backed government. They brutalized in ISIS fashion the president of Afghanistan. They hanged him from a lamppost. They stuffed American dollars in his mouth somewhat incongruously, along with the penis that they had cut off from his body. Najibullah was a friend of mine, full disclosure, and his demise will never leave me. And I knew then, if I did not know before, that the mutilations, head chopping, obscurantism, imprisoning of women, the blowing up of religious and historic artifacts was to be the calling card of that type of people everywhere in the world, that the empire found a temporary use for them. So let me say this in parenthesis to Miss Halima Khan and to Five Pillars. If you have any sympathy with these kind of people, stay away from us. We want nothing to do with you. And we're sorry that we ever had. The reality is, this barbarism, this mutilating, heart-eating barbarism is a curse on the Muslims. It's a curse on humanity. And those who support it are placing themselves beyond the pale of human civilization. And no one should have anything to do with any of them. But let me close the parenthesis and move on to a more significant point. We have just put ISIS and Al-Qaeda in control of the Mediterranean country of Syria, in the ancient Arab and Muslim capital of Damascus. The Umayyad Mosque, where John the Baptist's head is entombed, is now controlled by ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Now, you can put lipstick on a pig. You can even tie a Windsor knot on a necktie and put it round the neck of the former deputy leader of Al-Qaeda and the former deputy leader of ISIS. You can put him in a suit. You can put him in a tie. You can put him in a tutu. You can put him in a onesie. But he will always be the man who led al-Zarqawi's murder gang in Iraq and al-Baghdadi's murder gang in Syria. Now, Western leaders thought they were being clever. We'll use these people. We'll use them to get rid of the Syrian regime that we hate. We'll improve Israel's security, though perhaps only temporarily. We will destroy the remnants of Nasser's Arab nationalist movement. We'll put these obscurantists in power who've just appointed a minister for women who's Turkish and who has made it plain that the life of women and girls in Syria is going to look much more like the women and girls in Afghanistan henceforth. You can put the military commander of ISIS into one of the top generals' positions in the new Syrian armed forces. You can do these things, but don't expect that the end result will be any different to what happened in New Orleans at 3:15 this morning. Don't expect that you can control the monster that Frankenstein himself could not control. Because this nihilistic murder cult, death cult, has global ambitions, you know. They're not interested in the borders of the former Syrian Arab Republic any more than they were interested in the borders of Afghanistan. Twin Towers, anybody? Afghanistan, Tora Bora, 9/11. Do any of you Americans even remember these things? You've played with these people before. You've heroized these people before. You've armed them, funded them, covered your august journals with paeans of praise to them. You've done all this before, and now it's come back to bite you again in New Orleans. I love New Orleans, by the way. It's one of the reasons I'm so passionate in this monologue this evening. The thought of what happened there this morning is almost too much for me to bear. And I don't know how Americans can bear it. I really don't know. Now, this Jabbar, he's not an immigrant, not an illegal immigrant. He didn't come from Bangladesh or Yemen. He was born and raised in Beaumont, Texas. He served 10 years with the American Armed Forces. He even appeared on videos on YouTube in his capacity as an IT expert. I've just been watching him. Looks like an everyday, ordinary guy. But in his heart, in the recesses of his mind, he had been touched by the global ambitions of this death cult called ISIS, called Al-Qaeda, called anything you like. It's an alphabet soup, but it all spells fanatic, takfiri extremism, who, when they're not murdering fellow Muslims, including fellow Muslims from their own majority current of Islam, are murdering Muslims of other stripes. When they're not murdering Christians in Malula and in the valley of the Christians, when they're not murdering Alawites for no other reason than they are Alawites, when they are not cutting the heads off their own people, they're planning to murder you, planning to cut your head off, coming to a Christmas market near you, coming to a New Year celebration near you. Now, don't say I didn't warn you. I told you over and over and over again. I told William Hague in a trapped lift inside Parliament when he had just returned from Jordan, where he had promised what turned out to be massive expenditure of British taxpayers' money to the head choppers and throat cutters who are in control in Syria now, although not necessarily for the long term. I said to him, why are you sharpening the knives of people who may end up here in this building? As indeed they subsequently did. Thanks to a brave policeman, PC Keith Fletcher. They didn't get past the gate, but they murdered him. But if they had got past the gate, and if they'd gotten into the corridors of Westminster, trust me, they would have been just as happy using the knife sharpened by William Hague on William Hague himself. They murdered one of my colleagues, a fine, devout Christian man, Sir David Amos, Member of Parliament. They murdered him. They stabbed him 60, 70 times in his parliamentary surgery. These people don't care who they murder. They live to murder. Their purpose is murder. Murder and mayhem. It's like a devil dog, you know. You think it's your pet devil dog. But if you leave your small child in a room with it, your pet devil dog will murder it. And so I make this plea, even at this well past midnight, to the Western public, for I have no faith whatsoever in the Western leaders or their media. To the Western public, demand that your leaders stop feeding this beast of ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and the other organizations like it. These are all the consequences of Western decision-making over decades. Syria is only the latest chapter. What Donald Trump's going to do now, he'll have to think carefully, because there's thousands and thousands of foreign fighters in Syria. If he now attacks it, the quadrant where these people are, it will be the equivalent of smashing a hornet's nest. If he moves in to smash it, they will scatter everywhere. First around the region, and then around the world. There's a saying for all of this. In normal life, that normal, non-political people understand. Be careful what you wish for, because you might just get it. We've got Professor Mohammed Marandi from the University of Tehran coming up now, I'm sure, to tell you some of the same from a different perspective. Stay tuned. This is the mother of all talk shows.